Good evening and welcome to this 2-hour webinar designed to introduce you to predictive analytics or predictive risk modeling and how it has been used or may be used in child welfare or family regulation. My name is Ronald Richter. I lead JCCA, an almost 200-year-old child and family serving organization in New York. I've served in various roles in New York's child welfare system, a system that has fairly been described as regulating families. This means that among the system's many goals has been to figure out which families pose a risk to their family, which families pose a risk to their children, and then how government may intervene to regulate parental behaviors so that children may be safer. Of course, government defines safety, an always subjective standard, and in doing so, Black families have always been disproportionately represented among the regulated. Since I represented families as a legal services lawyer in Bedford-Stuyvesant in the 1990s, I have been struck by how almost all of the children and parents affected by child welfare are people of color. Even as a judge in Queens just a decade ago, the most diverse borough in the country, where 50 languages are spoken in the family court, the families on my child protective docket were mostly Black. Much research has confirmed this. Not much has been done about it. Black families are more investigated, found to be mistreating their children more. Black children are removed more, and they remain in foster care longer. It is true across the country. As a result, some suggest we should do away with the government system to protect children. Today, we are talking about one tool that some argue can effectively reduce the disproportionate number of Black children embroiled in the system using data-driven social science. As in all matters related to regulating families, the tool is controversial. Today, we will also explore why. Why so much controversy in child welfare? As you all are well aware and have likely discussed, our nation has a history of systemically enslaving, wrongly accusing, and marginalizing Black people. Black communities have been systematically under-resourced in a multitude of ways. Therefore, when we talk about a tool that may help reduce disproportionality in family regulation, sincere issues of trust are surfaced, especially from those of us who have witnessed firsthand what child welfare looks like on the ground, and also those who have been historically judged by the system and feel strongly that many children and families have been misjudged, that the government's wide net has not really gotten much right. About 2 years ago, my colleague, Professor Anne Williams-Isom, and I gathered about a dozen folks who work in child and family services in New York City, because while we had all heard of predictive analytics, we did not fully understand the tool or how it was being used in New York City. Since then, we have learned a lot. Today is about sharing our learning with a wide audience of New Yorkers who care deeply about children and families, and who want to understand potential pathways to our very concerning outcomes and the impact we have had on the people we all hope to support. We are fortunate today to have one of our work group participants moderating our program, NYU McSilver Institute Executive Director, Dr. Michael Lindsey. Dr. Lindsey is a noted scholar in the fields of child and adolescent mental health, as well as a leader in the search for knowledge and solutions to generational poverty and inequality. He leads the working group for the Congressional Black Caucus.
Yeah, I can pick up from there. Thank you, Judge Richter, and everyone for joining us this afternoon or this evening. On behalf of everyone watching, we appreciate what you, Judge Richter, and Professor Anne Williams-Isom, a dear friend, have done to organize this evening's examination of predictive risk modeling in child welfare practice. And we at the McSilver Institute appreciate the partnership with the Fordham University Graduate School of Social Service in this discussion. To everyone else watching, welcome. This evening, we'll learn how machine learning and data mining are being used to identify which children are at risk and where resources and support are needed. The conversation will include how these tools are being used outside of New York City. It will also cover how such tools can recreate the disproportionate representation of Black families in child welfare and family regulation systems. Our guests include two experts who have helped design predictive risk models, an official from Los Angeles County, where predictive modeling is being implemented, an American Civil Liberties Union representative who will review the National Survey on Predictive Analytics in Child Welfare Systems, and an authority on how people react to these and other issues connected to race and bias. The McSilver Institute is excited to take part in this examination. We just announced ourselves the launch of the AI Hub at McSilver, which builds on our mission to disrupt generational poverty and address racial disparities. Our work in this space involves using predictive analytics to identify Black and Brown youth who are at risk for suicide and mental illness. McSilver runs a technical assistance center for New York's child welfare, behavioral health, and intellectual and developmental disability focused agency workforce. We view predictive analytics and other AI tools as a double-edged sword. They can be transformational in helping us to identify people whose health and well-being are at risk. Yet they also can perpetuate or even magnify structural inequities by relying on data sets and assumptions that already reflect societal biases. There must be a rigorous examination of the ways the social service and government agencies use these tools in partnership with researchers, subject matter experts, and practitioners and community members. And it's important to have transparency in how data is collected, mined, and then used to make decisions that affect lives. Furthermore, we can't overlook the voices of those who are impacted by such decisions. Their feedback must be included as these tools are developed and used. And there's an urgent need to get more people from Black and Brown communities in the pipeline of those who develop, test, and monitor these systems. With that, let's dive into this evening's program. After I introduce each panelist, I will drop the bios for each speaker in the chat so you can read more information about who they are. First, we have Anjana Samant, Senior Staff Attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union's Women's Rights Project, who will provide context by briefing us on the survey of predictive analytics in child welfare in the US. Welcome, Anjana.
All right, sorry about that. I am hopefully sharing my screen now so that folks can see a PowerPoint. So I want to thank the organizers of the panel and my co-panelists. You know, as someone who's never had any contact with the child welfare system, I've spent the past 3 years speaking with parents, organizations, researchers, former foster youth, advocates, and lawyers about how child welfare involvement results in more harm than good to so many women and girls in particular, and creates barriers instead of pathways to self-determination. Through these conversations, it became apparent that gender stereotypes, racism, and class bias are part of what triggers government regulation of women in particular as parents. None of this is news. One of the goals of the ACLU Women's Rights Project is challenging such embedded discrimination, gender discrimination, and of course, setting limits on the government's ability to control women's bodies, choices, and lives. Predictive analytics tools at the most general level take in historical data, look for patterns, and try to predict some outcome or event. To the extent that a jurisdiction has historically opened more home visits or investigations into, say, Black women or Native American women than they have into white women, or more families experiencing housing instability, food insecurity, or poverty than families that are not, the historical data is going to reflect factors associated with these communities and demographics. And so it is that we started looking at the use of data analytics and automated decision-making in family regulation. At the end of September, the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU released a report that identified where child welfare agencies in the US were using, developing, or had stopped using predictive analytics tools. I'm going to give a shout out to my colleague, Kath Xu, a Skadden Fellow, who really spearheaded the research and analysis. So thanks to her, as well as to my co-panelist, Aaron Horowitz, for his work on this report. The report, which is available online, includes a table of our findings by jurisdiction, along with some of the racial justice, gender equity, and civil liberties implications and context in which these tools are being rolled out. I'm going to give you some of the report's top line findings and also flesh out some of the concerns that we've raised in the document, which certainly we at the ACLU have raised with, among others, Rima and Emily before today. And for today's purposes, which I'm just going to lump under the heading of false confidence concerns. I welcome responses from my co-panelists because I would love to be wrong or be told that I'm missing something. And I also have one general question that I'll throw out there or something to ponder right now. And that namely relates to lessons from the pandemic. One of the things that's come out of the pandemic is stories and experience of what happened when, as folks have called it, there was a sort of a de facto suspension of at least new investigations, visitations, fewer complaints coming into hotlines, and work by child welfare agencies. And the question that I have is really, how are child welfare agencies and tool designers looking at the experiences and data coming out of this time period? While I'm not sure of the exact situation in LA County or Allegheny County, many places did see decreases in child welfare agency interventions. And so far to date, we have not had evidence from, for instance, mandatory reporters that suddenly they're seeing indications that there actually had been some pandemic of abuse going on behind closed doors while people were in lockdown and schools were shut down. So what does this tell us about how children fare absent government involvement? And what does the data from this period tell us? And what will it tell us about, and I would say, I would ask, how will it be used to modify, update, or revisit the usefulness of tools that are already in place? But back to the report for now. So it turns out, in terms of what tools are covered in the report, it turns out that there are a lot of tools out there that involve looking into the past for patterns and applying them to present cases. As a result, we focused on one category of these tools, namely all those that systematically apply historical data to predict on an individual or geographic basis the likelihood of some outcome or event that is a proxy for future child abuse or neglect. And we have some illustrations coming, so that will make more sense. Using this definition, we found that jurisdictions in at least half of US states are using or have considered using predictive analytics in child welfare decisions. Some overall findings. 11 jurisdictions, so that's states, counties, and/or cities, are using a tool on a pilot or regular basis. 6 are consulting, meaning that they're exploring the development or adoption of a tool or have partnered with tool developers for such purposes. 7 have dropped a tool, and 10 explored the possibility, but we couldn't find any public indication that either they had in fact implemented the tool or confirmation that they had actually dropped the tool. In the remaining jurisdictions, we didn't find information one way or another about use of the tool. And please note, you can find more information on our methodology and definitions in the report itself. So how and when are tools used? Even though we looked at only one class of predictive analytics tools, we found considerable variation in how these tools were used or in what where in time or at what decision point they were used. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but we'll talk about some of the more popular ones and the concerns that they raise. Among the jurisdictions using tools or consulting about them, the most common ones were these four: screening tools, a hotspot model, open case review, and reentry prediction. And among the jurisdictions that dropped tools or had explored them but never implemented them, the same four top the list. Screening tools, turning to those for a minute, are those used, like the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, are ones used to help decide whether a call or complaint to a child welfare agency or hotline should be dismissed outright or followed up on by the agency. Now, since it's impossible to predict injury or accidents or death, screening tools like the Allegheny Family Screening Tool are designed to predict a proxy for these. So in the case of the AFST, it's designed to predict the odds that a child will be removed from the home for placement elsewhere within 2 years of the complaint. The Hotspot Model, which has been put out by a group called Predict, Align, Prevent, maps out, uses tools that map out 500 by 500 square foot areas throughout the jurisdiction where they're looking at, where it found children to be, quote, at the greatest risk of maltreatment, end quote. How? They look at historical case files and scan them for what they call environmental risk and protective features. And so you can see, here's a list on the left-hand side of some of the both. Risk factors would be places where, or rather, whether cases or the number of cases in that specific area that had been accepted for investigation, the number of children who had been removed, the number of building code violations in that area, among other things. Protective features or protective land uses, which you'll see mapped on the right side, include things like community centers, schools, and churches. So this is a map of Richmond that PAP came up with, and it's color-coded to reflect what they call degree of risk areas. Essentially, once they have put together this map, PAP and or the city pull together service organizations or government agencies to do outreach and figure out some kind of plan of action to mitigate what the risk factors are. I was going to skip over much of what ACS does in the interest of time, but I'll at least talk about one of the two tools that fit our definition. And that is the severe harm predictive model, or what we called open case review. Basically, this tool predicts the odds that a child in an open case will be the subject of substantiated allegations of physical or sexual abuse in the next 18 months. Once an open case has been flagged as such, those cases are reviewed by a particular unit within ACS. So it's almost like a little bit of an auditing process to identify cases that they think are higher risk. LA County model, which I admit I know less about. It's slightly different. After a call is screened in for investigation, the tool is used at that point. And if it finds that the report falls beyond a certain degree of risk, and in terms of risk of what, I know that one of the risk metrics that they use is placement in foster care. I know there's another one, but don't know the specifics. But at any rate, if the tool flags a referred in matter as above a certain degree of risk, the case is flagged for the supervisor as what they're calling a complex risk case. And I'm going to let my co-panelist from LA County explain what that actually means in terms of how the case is treated within the agency. I don't know how much has been released about LA County tools, risk metrics or features or weights that are attached to them. So hopefully we can hear a little bit more about if that is actually available somewhere online, or if they intend to disclose that information, which I think, as most folks know, Allegheny County and the tool designers there certainly have done. And now turning to the false confidence concerns, which I welcome my co-panelists to respond to as well. So Since I'm a lawyer, these have subparts. The first one is the tool reduce, one asserted reason for using the tool is that it will reduce racial disparities. But I'm going to say that none of these tools are cure-alls, so we need to be wary of any jurisdiction who wants to use the tool by itself and make no other changes to fix a racial disparity problem. At most, a tool might reduce racial disparities at one particular point in the family regulation process, but disparities exist at multiple points along the continuum. So even if, let's say, a screening tool results in fewer Black families being referred in for visits or for investigation, that doesn't necessarily mean fewer Black families will be placed on safety plans or have their kids removed temporarily or permanently. Second, I would urge people to keep in mind that the race and gender inequity perpetuated by these tools is about more, or requires more than just leveling numbers. We also are talking about trying to limit harmful and improper state involvement in the lives of families, women, and children. I'm going to note that, for instance, in terms of how disparities have been reduced, the AFST put out an impact evaluation that explained that while the tool was in use, they reduced racial disparities. And that was done because the rate of white children referred in for intervention increased, and there were slight declines in the rate at which Black children were referred in for investigation. So the racial disparity at the point of whether complaints are dismissed or flagged for agency action certainly decreased at that moment. But aside from numbers, we want to keep in mind that most complaints that go to child welfare agencies are about neglect and not abuse. Similarly, the majority of complaints referred in for agency action are also flagged for neglect, not abuse. This is nationally, these are the statistics. And while I don't have Allegheny County's numbers in particular, in 2019 in Pennsylvania statewide, 63% of removals involve neglect, which is defined as alleged or substantiated negligent treatment or maltreatment, including a failure to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, or care, and includes failure to provide supervision. In other words, a huge part of what's going on when in Pennsylvania complaints are made to the child welfare agencies and those complaints are investigated, and even when kids are removed, a huge part of what's going on is factors related to poverty and lack of supportive social systems. But as folks will tell you, and I agree, certainly poverty is not to be equated with neglect. In designing the AFST, its creators found that yes, a lot of conditions that are associated with removals in the county's recent past were indeed about poverty. What you'll see here, these are only some of the variables or features that were found to relate to removal within 2 years by the tool designers. And I don't have here which of the variables were weighted more heavily than others. But at any rate, if poverty is a running theme, instead of requiring parents to complete safety plans or some other battery of services or programs, why not address the conditions themselves? And in the context of the utility of these tools, rather than spending $1 million or more on a new predictive analytics tool, could that money instead be given to families for purpose in the form of maybe housing vouchers or subsidies? Or if you know that mothers with health coverage have better outcomes, maybe the money could go towards health insurance and quality healthcare providers so that their kids get preventative care. Or maybe they need transportation, travel vouchers to get their kids to doctor's appointments, drop them off at school, and get to work. Better yet, we were willing to cut people checks during the pandemic. Why not simply provide money that isn't specifically earmarked, that isn't conditioned on completion of a service or program? I'm going to turn to false confidence concern number 2. Another asserted reason for using tools is that statistical analyses show that they are incredibly accurate, but it's not necessarily that they're really accurate at flagging potential neglect or abuse. Rather, what they actually are predicting, at least, is whether the state is going to see you as someone who engages in maltreatment. In the case of the AFST, certainly it predicts the odds that a child will enter into foster care in 2 years. So I'll give an analogy to the criminal justice system, where risk assessment tools often measure the likelihood of rearrest, but arrest doesn't mean you actually committed a crime, and maybe more heavily influenced by where you live, your race, whether you have access to mental health services or housing. And one thing that you can't ever really change is if you, in the past, have an arrest or conviction. Similarly, whether your child is removed and placed outside the home does not necessarily mean that you posed a threat to your child, and may in fact be more indicative of where you live, whether you have access to housing or mental health services, whether you have a past arrest or past involvement in the foster system. So one question I would ask for my co-panelists as well is, if folks really, really do want to use a predictive tool, why not use the tool to measure whether the services being required of parents are associated with reunification or child's entry into foster care? Maybe it isn't that the family is failing or parents are unable to care for the child. Maybe at the very least, the interventions that are being required by the state aren't helping or are inappropriate. False confidence.
Jenna, excuse me for a second. I'm going to just ask that you wrap it up because we need to move on to the next speakers.
Sure.
This is incredibly awesome, but thank you for closing it out so we can move to the next speakers.
Yeah, this is my last slide, not a problem. A final asserted reason for using these tools is that they are more objective or less biased than human decision makers. And you can actually explain how a tool reached a certain score or recommendation and explain the tool's thinking behind those. Except that we've already talked about how data sets are skewed. But one thing I'm going to add is scores aren't typically disclosed. At least we haven't come across any tool where part of its proper use is to disclose the score or how the score was considered to the person or family involved. So if explainability of a score doesn't seem to be a very good reason for adopting a tool, if the policy is going to be not to ever turn that score over or its use. So I would just, and the last point that I would just make is, while Allegheny County definitely has disclosed a detailed methodology report, impact evaluation, and definitely, shared also data with us as well and welcomed us to evaluate it with them, I would say as these tools start spreading, other jurisdictions using similar risk assessment tools or ones that are based off of the AFST have not made these disclosures, and it's not clear whether they necessarily intend to. So, ensuring that as these things are replicated elsewhere, they're also replicated in the same way that they were implemented in the first place would certainly, be helpful. So I'm gonna stop there then.
Ajana, thank you for such an insightful presentation. Next, we have Drs. Emily Putnam-Hornstein and Dr. Rima Vaidyanathan. And they're going to talk to us about predictive risk models. Dr. Putnam-Hornstein is the John A. Tate Distinguished Professor of Children in Need and Director of Policy Practice at the UNC Chapel Hill School of Social Work, as well as co-director of the Children's Data Network. Dr. Vaidyanathan is Professor of Social Data Analytics at the University of Auckland. And so I present to you the two doctors.
Thank you, Professor Lindsey, and thank you, Anjana, for sharing what ACLU has been doing in terms of a survey. I do agree with you, Anjana, these tools are not a cure-all. I think that's really important to emphasize that. I thought I would share with you the journey of my research history and how I came to being part of this work in child welfare. So I'm actually a health economist, so I've had more than 20 years of experience in healthcare systems. And so my original work was in the use of predictive risk models in healthcare, mainly working with family practitioners, family physicians who were trying to identify patients for prevention programs, hospital avoidance programs. And what the evidence was finding is that whilst doctors are very good at being able to kind of understand the crisis in front of them, they're less able, and it's very understandable why, able to know which patients are going to have long-term, sort of long arc risk, as we call it, sort of become chronically involved in healthcare systems over the next 2 years. And so they were finding it difficult when they were offered sort of in the community prevention programs to identify which of their many patients to offer up for those programs. And they tended to constantly offer up the patients who were in crisis, and rather than the patients who were going to have a long arc risk. So I did a lot of shadowing of clinicians, try to understand what the problems were. And the problems were they were very pushed and stretched, you know, working in high need communities. I was working in rural communities, in urban settings, very push. And so when it came to being asked, who do you want to offer, they ended up finding that these sort of predictive risk models as an additional tool really helped them identify patients they might not have identified otherwise. So over a decade ago, Emily Putnam-Hornstein is going to speak soon, and I started asking, could some of these methods be useful for child welfare? And so we've published a few papers on what that might look like. And subsequently, Allegheny County, which is the county surrounding the city of Pittsburgh, did a call for proposals. So Allegheny had been using their data really well. They'd had integrated data. But they wanted to see if there were data tools out there that they could bring to their system, to their frontline workers, to help them navigate their services better. And so one of the points that so we won that, Emily and I won that RFP. And one of the points that the county identified early on is that they felt they weren't very confident about the decisions being made was exactly what Anjana was talking about. At that point that the call comes in, and Allegheny, like lots of counties around the country, were seeing an escalation in the number of referrals coming in. And their call screeners were basically making effectively a judgment call and deciding that 50% of these calls were not needing investigation and 50% of the calls were requiring investigation. Now, you know, they were experienced call screeners. They were, of course, talking to the supervisor. But at the end of the day, it was really reading the narrative, looking up data systems, very complicated data systems, multitude of data systems, to understand whether there was a kind of content of the narrative plus the risks involved in this family that required an investigation. So understandably, when I shadowed as a person from the outside, when I shadowed those calls, I personally would have found them all really concerning, but that's not how our system is set up. It has to find 50% of calls roughly, or found 50% of calls that they couldn't investigate. So we ended up also speaking to the community. I spoke to people who aged out, families who've had children removed, to try to understand what their concerns were about the system and what their concerns were about the use of the data. So after that work, we went back and built a predictive risk model that we thought could be used at that point. Of course, we had to validate it, make sure it was reasonably predictive enough. We also needed to make sure that was predicting things like fatalities, near fatalities. We had to make sure it was also predicting even though that's not what it was so-called trained to do, it was also able to pick up children at escalated risk of maltreatment, hospitalization, for example. What we think of as out-of-system kind of ground truth things. This tool was sort of lining up with those sorts of external validation. After that, before deploying the tool, we also went back and looked at current practice. Remember, I said the current practice was very much about supervisors and call screeners making that decision themselves. And when we looked at current practice, two things really stood out. One is that the county was screening in a lot of low risk, so children who would be scored low risk on this tool. And when you followed those investigations, there was really nothing happening. So there was an opportunity now to maybe screen more of them out. The other thing that was striking is that Black children who were scored a low score were more likely to be investigated than white children who scored a low score. And white children who scored a high score were more likely to not be investigated than Black children who scored a high score. And these were statistically significant. So it suggested a sort of a patterning of decisions being made when those were made by a kind of clinical professional judgment. And so together we then looked at the tool in how it predicted for subgroups. We looked at fairness. And the other thing that the county did is commissioned an independent ethicist to give them independent advice about the ethics of using this tool. That had also come from my experience in healthcare, where I think we were concerned in healthcare right from the start about the sort of ethical context of the use of these sorts of tools for hospital avoidance programs. So I've had a long history of trying to understand and uncover ethical concerns. So between at that point, the county decided that there was enough information here for them to justify rolling the tool out. And subsequently, it was subject to an independent evaluation, the interim evaluation. The ethics report is also all contained online. And I think, from my point of view, I've always felt that these are tools that have the opportunity to improve the quality of decision making. They do, I think, have the opportunity to disclose, mirror our actions in terms of racial bias and other kinds of systemic decision making that might be inherent in human systems. And to the extent that they're used with careful guardrails around them, I think they also offer an opportunity for us to try and address some of those systemic biases that we see. That's my timer. So at that point, I'm going to hand it to Emily Putnam-Hornstein. Thanks, Emily.
Well done with the timer, Rima. I love it. Just wanted to kind of thank everyone for organizing today, and thank our fellow panelists for being willing to engage on this topic. And I have to admit that I feel totally conflicted at this moment in time, because on the one hand, Anjana, I'm super appreciative that the ACLU is helping to elevate these questions around the front end or front door of our child protection system, how it operates, the decisions that are being made, the tools that are used. Let me just say, for the record, the field is long overdue for a critical review of the system, and particularly the front end of the system. And as Rima described, that's really what kind of pulled me into this work, was an interest in the front end of the system. That said, one of the things that I'm kind of concerned about, and I just want to surface this up front, and then I will reflect and hopefully share a little bit about how the system is currently operating. So one of the things that concerns me is that there has this examination, this critical review, which is so needed, has so quickly narrowed to focus on newer risk assessment approaches or the use of algorithms at the complete exclusion of the status quo and what agencies and workers are using as decision aids today, which I can assure you are all 20 years and then some out of date. And so I kind of want to throw that out there because I just don't understand how we can have a discussion about, ooh, is the use of algorithms good or bad without saying, well, wait a second, how are child protection systems making decisions, screening calls, making assignments, determining when we open cases? And that really hasn't been done. And I also, I just kind of want to acknowledge, I'm sure every single person on this panel would like to see more consistent, equitable, and sound decision-making at the front end of our system. And I have publicly stated this before, and I will affirm again here, that I think our system has suffered from terrible mission creep. I don't think that 1/3 of American children should experience an investigation during childhood. And I think there's been far too little attention paid to the consequences of unnecessary investigations for families, especially low-income families and families of color. But I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that I don't think this should be called a family regulation system. This is not intended to be punitive. There are children in our communities who need protection. We know that locally in New York City, just with some of the recent coverage there. And I think that what is getting lost in these debates about kind of are algorithms good or bad is that this work is incredibly difficult that we ask our child protection system and our frontline staff to do. And it's incredibly important. And Rima mentioned that just in terms of, shadowing as an outsider and feeling like every single one of these calls we needed to respond to. And so I just want to kind of make sure that we are not losing track of that, because the goal here is to improve the system. And in my mind, there is no way that we can do that unless we are helping equip the front end of our system with better ways of using data that we are already asking them to hold and factor into their decision-making process. And so I think I just want to kind of, reinforce. Think about how hard this work is. We are asking child protection workers to pick up the phone, receive a call from a community member who may have only been an indirect observer of the concerns they have about a child. And we're asking them to assess the severity of the immediate allegation. And that's hard in its own right. But what we're also asking our child protection system and workforce to do is to situate that new allegation of abuse or neglect. And I also want to say, I know it's really easy to say neglect is just synonymous with poverty, but we have been looking more closely at that in California, reading the narratives, and I can tell you that these neglect allegations that are coming in involve parental substance abuse, parental mental health conditions, pretty significant domestic violence. We can have a conversation as a field as to whether those should be directed to Child Protective Services or not. But I don't think that it's fair to act as if the system is simply responding to poverty. And I think we do a disservice to families and communities when we allow that narrative to continue. So back to what we ask our workforce to do, we ask them to look at the specific allegation at hand, but we also ask them to not just think about the immediate kind of safety of the child, but also the risk of future harm, whether that's 6 months out or 12 months out. And we hold them responsible for delivering the correct array of services that would remedy whatever led to this call and will prevent future harm. And to be able to do that, we ask them to look at data that will allow them to better understand whether there are chronic conditions that may not have even been mentioned in this call, but we know exist from past involvement. And so, one thing I was kind of thinking about in the context of REMA and coming from a background in health is, we expect doctors to consider a patient's medical history and co-occurring conditions when they determine a course of treatment or order an additional test or make a referral to a specialist. And we assume that those doctors have examined past lab results, that they're kind of tracking disease progression, regardless of whether those earlier tests have resulted in any specific diagnosis. And so it's totally understandable that we ask our child protection workers to review family history and to understand this allegation in the context of kind of challenges that may have surfaced in the past. What I think is perhaps lost on a lot of people who are further removed from the system is that the way that we deliver that history to workers is so haphazard. We ask them to do manual and time-consuming searches. It's interesting to me, I can assure you that our child protection systems are hardly operating as big brother fed by big data. Frankly, my concern are not algorithms, but truly mundane challenges that undermine children's safety and pose threats to family integrity, things like dated technologies and rudimentary risk assessment tools that dominate the field. And there's none that stands out more in my mind than structured decision-making. And the fact that the ACLU said the tools are widespread doesn't mean they should be. So I'm gonna kind of stop here and just say that that's why I honestly believe that counties like Allegheny and Douglas County and Los Angeles should be held out, frankly, as models, because it would be so easy to just keep doing what they've been doing, because that's what everybody else is doing. And if we want our system to look exactly the same 5 years from now as it does today, then by all means, let's say no to algorithms. But if we actually want to try to move the needle in a way that kind of maintains child safety and recognizes that the system has grown too big, I think that these tools are a critical piece. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over.
All right, thank you, Drs. Putnam-Hornstein and Vaithianathan. Now we will hear from Jenny Faria, Deputy Director of the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services. She will let us know what risk modeling looks like on the ground in Los Angeles County.
Good afternoon, everyone. So Los Angeles County Child Welfare's exploration of predictive risk modeling began about 7 years ago. And our former director, who had come from the Department of Public Social Services, brought a data mining concept that they had used to detect the child care fraud. And in 2014, the LA County Blue Ribbon Commission had released a final report regarding a number of fatalities that had occurred. And this is a similar, occurrence across the nation. Tragedies that, we are trying to prevent and want to learn from to do better in our practice. Our former director wanted to provide better tools for the social workers in hope of preventing tragic outcomes for children, and began exploring use of similar analytics technology for the detection of risk to children. At that time, a proof of concept, which we had called Project Aura, an acronym for Approach to Understanding Risk, utilized historical de-identified data to test whether child fatalities or critical incidents could be anticipated. And this proof of concept was completed by a vendor, and there was a lack of transparency to the elements of the algorithm. This often is referred to as a black box. And there were some really valuable lessons that we learned from that proof of concept. While there were promising results, a key was that predictive risk modeling must, and I emphasize must, be an open source, non-proprietary algorithm in a glass box to ensure there's transparency. We also learned that working with researchers or academics instead of the black box proprietary software developed by for-profit companies is critical for several reasons. to help ensure that the data does not perpetuate racial or ethnic disproportionality, to facilitate dialogue with our community stakeholders to ensure data is being used safely and ethically, and to ensure DCFS has the capacity to update and validate data and improvements to the model with local data in real time, improving the accuracy of the model. Then in October 2018, the California Department of Social Services convened the community work group on risk assessment, where about a dozen California counties and stakeholders explored opportunities for predictive risk modeling. Stakeholders included researchers, media, advocates, and others. Their plan was to incorporate reviews with the public to ensure bias was addressed. We secured a consultant, CDSS secured a consultant to conduct an ethical review, and many potential use cases were explored. It was very clear that it would not be used for decision-making purposes. The exploratory group ended up pausing in November 2018 after a change in leadership at the state level. The state had indicated at that time that they were going to shift their efforts to other existing tools. And now currently, and most recently in August 2021, Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services began testing or piloting what we call risk stratified supervision. And this pilot is a data-informed approach that relies heavily on clinical experience and enhanced oversight for investigations in cases where the stakes are high and the family service needs are typically more significant than usual. It provides supervisors with a method to better ensure complex risk cases receive the staffing resources and the attention necessary to protect children and strengthen families. This supports quality and consistent casework, reducing unintentional practice errors. And it allows us to focus on our core responsibility of making sure children and families are safe and are well-being. And to help determine how to allocate intensive resources. This is something that we struggle with constantly in child welfare, such as prevention and aftercare or nurse home visitation, whether that's before placement or post reunification. And the model uses information from records maintained by the statewide system and does not include race or geographical data of the family. There's 3 applications or reports that we're currently testing by staff in the pilot offices. One of them is a flag that's provided to the supervisors overseeing emergency response investigations, which alerts them to a new investigation that is deemed to be complex risk. And a complex risk flag indicates there's a high likelihood of future reports to DCFS and eventual placement in foster care. And so an investigation overview report is the second application. And this is to provide supervisors a summary of information that can be time consuming to review and pull together right immediately before the social worker has to rush out to ensure the child is safe. A third part of the application is a racial equity report and feedback loop protocol, which examines the low-risk referrals that were screened in for investigation involving Black and African-American children. This intentional review identifies screening practices and community reporting patterns that may result in unnecessary investigations that disproportionately burden low-income and Black and African-American families. We will also take a closer look at referrals that did not result in any inconclusive or substantiated allegations involving Black and African-American children and families for opportunities for change in practice. The goal is to help us better understand local reporting dynamics that may contribute to Black families being unnecessarily referred to the community, and or screened in by our department for investigation. And this work is being led by our Office of Equity in collaboration with Continuous Quality Improvement Division. And based on these reviews, the Office of Equity will then develop some recommendations to reduce the bias in reporting, improve the manner in which we screen the referrals, create additional avenues for differential response pathways. So for those families that are reported and there is no investigation and no concern for abuse and neglect, connecting them to prevention services to help strengthen the family or with any family needs. And also to help more families, just remain in the community without having any child welfare involvement. And so I want to then also focus on the engagement efforts. That is an extremely important part of the exploration that we have completed or even are ongoing in LA County. It's been a process of engagement and learning for LA County. It's evolved into a small pilot that I mentioned and reflects the conversations and decisions made on community feedback. We continue to engage and actively listen to our communities, especially those with lived experience, to adjust or course correct as we need to. Extensive efforts have been made, and we're continuing to make ongoing efforts to engage both internal and external key stakeholders, having community town halls, parent town halls, engaging our county partners, and eradicating racial disproportionality and disparity. We have a leadership group spearheading these efforts, walking along side by side with that advisory group, as well as that steering committee in how we can adjust, and faith-based collaborative, our board of supervisors, as well as our Child Welfare Council, Union, and Children and Family Commission. So we really try to engage and be transparent in the conversation as we try to learn together. And some really key points that I want to close with.
You have about 1 minute left. Jenny, you have about 1 minute left.
Great. So some key points I really want to close with is a transparent model is really critical. Allowing the department and community at large to track disparities and correct for them. Clearly, community buy-in is key to the success of any data-driven model. A few of our, local community stakeholders, we really are honored to have them along the journey with us, to be partners, to keep us accountable and to keep us honest, and to really call to our attention when there needs to be an adjustment. And so a slow pace and timing is essential. As I mentioned earlier, we're continuing to explore and engage. And this has been so far a 7-year process that we are continuing on this journey. So thank you so much for having me today.
Great, thank you, Jenny. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A chat feature. We're using that as a way to communicate questions. Finally, we're going to hear from Jay Khadija Abdurrahman, a fellow at Columbia University, NYU's AI Now Institute, and UCLA C212, and Aaron Horowitz, who is the Chief Data Scientist for the ACLU. They will weigh in on what has been discussed so far and what we need to look out for as predictive risk modeling is put into practice.
Michael, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And just in addition to like profound Zoom anxiety, I have ADHD and hella kids and also sirens in the background. So like, bear with me. I would ask, how the audience is feeling after so many presentations, but I know the chat is disabled, which I think also is a good kind of reflection of the state of the system, right? About who is able to participate. And at the end of the day, my professional affiliations aside, like I would identify as a baby mama, as somebody who is ratchet. This is who is targeted. As Emily said, it's not just that investigations around neglect are synonymous with poverty. In fact, what I see in New York City is that even though Asian Americans have some of the highest rates of poverty per capita, they don't have the highest rates of investigation. In fact, what we see is that Black Americans and specifically Puerto Ricans who have, relative to the reliance on forms of public assistance that have the highest rate of surveillance, have a higher rate of representation in investigations. And so I got a lot of slides to keep me on track. So I'm gonna share screen, 1 second. Let's see, view, present. Okay, so I hope you guys can see this. I got some videos, I got some pictures. I think it'll be fun. So we need to talk about predictive analytics. This is in the spirit of we need to talk about Kevin. I don't know if you guys seen this movie, but it's examining the childhood of this young, white, cisgendered male who lacks remorse and empathy, and people are concerned about their violence. And then this kind of mirrors who is designing in the worldview that's embedded in predictive analytics. So that was the spirit in which this slide was designed. And I actually, maybe counterposed to Emily, love the phrase family regulation system. And I think that these terms like child welfare system, child protective services really get us off track because they invoke this kind of Dunantis humanitarian notion of care, rather than really looking at how functionally, what do just quote unquote child protective services actually do to populations of people? Who are they specifically targeting? And I just want to disclose exactly what is my relationship to the family regulation system, because it is multiple. And I do want to recognize that we're in National Adoption Awareness Month. And as far as I know, there's no adoptees on this panel. And that is pretty typical of what happens within adoption, within that triad relationship of biological or impacted parent, adopted child who becomes an adult, and adoptive parent. Typically, the adoptive person is cut out from their communities, from their biological relationships, and from the academic discourse and knowledge that's produced about their situation. So to disclose, I'm not an adoptee. I did attend residential school from 12 to 17, and I grew up with a lot of international adoptees, kids in foster care. My mother and my son's father were adopted by their grandparents. I have 4 kids that I adopted and fostered through kinship foster care. Kin Gap came out in the middle of that, which was a kind of a guardian assistance program, but that wasn't available to me in the beginning. If that was available, I probably would have gone that route to not legally terminate the parental rights, given what I understand about how that enhances and exacerbates the trauma. I also have been investigated by the New York City Administration for Children's Services twice. So that's a little bit about myself. And, you know, unfortunately, there is no adoptee here, but I wanted to share some hashtags that you guys can look at on TikTok or Twitter. I think Facebook is going downhill now, but these are some ways to get in touch with adoptee perspectives. And I wanted to share one video. Let me just make sure that I have new share. Let me make sure it's sharing computer sound. Here we go. And if you guys can just let me know if you can't hear the sound, I wanted to share this TikTok video.
You know, I've been thinking about it, and I think it's time for me to tell the truth. And the truth is, adoption is not trauma. It's really fucking beautiful. And the reason that it's beautiful is because it gives kids who are orphans and unwanted in this world a new life and parents that love them unconditionally. I mean, besides the conditions that they have to change their name, get rid of their culture, and completely erase who they are, that's the only thing, but it's beautiful. And the reason why we want them to get rid of their past and their heritage is we don't need them to drag themselves down in their new life with us. The only thing they need after their adoption is our love. That's why adoption is great. Gotcha. No, it ain't. It's still traumatic as fuck. Inherently, it's inhumane. And also, no human has the right to rename another human or take them away from their culture. No human. So remember, on this beautiful Indigenous Peoples Day, that millions of Indigenous children were ripped from their tribes, put into boarding schools, most of them killed and put into mass graves. But adoption is beautiful, right? And the system has no flaws.
And so,
you know, I've been thinking about it. And
can I go to the next slide though? Sorry, 1 second. View, present. So that's Carlos Dillard, and you can find him at the handle is Word of the State. This person actually also published a book about their experience in foster care. And I just think that it's really important that we center this experience, because even though there's a lot of critique in the data and tech policy community about this I'm just an engineer mindset, there's a way that we can still default to this very, let's find a technical solution. Let's think about disparities and which model is being chosen for the algorithm, that we can almost forget that this 2-hour event is about the decimation of communities and about the separation of families. And also, even the question of, are we screening in the call makes a decision about should that child be separated from their family in that moment, but it doesn't include what happens to them when they're placed into care, when they're placed into adoptive families, where the rate of serious abuse, injury, and murder is much higher than the general population. And so the other thing is, I disclosed my own positionality, and I want to say when I promoted this event, I had a lot of angry adoptees. Some people don't prefer that identification. Some people prefer trafficked or just being part of the adoption industry complex. Come into my DMs on Twitter because they're like F ACLU, which I was surprised because I was so focused on the people who had developed this commercial product of predictive risk modeling. And their issue with ACLU was specifically that there's a lot of adoptees who want access to their original birth certificate. And because adoption is not just cutting off the ties with all the relations in the community, it's also a legal procedure that changes people's access to their administrative data. My understanding of the ACLU's position is based off of civil liberties and privacy and protecting the biological mother's privacy. But both that TikTok video and that concern, I think, brings us to the question of administrative data, right? There's a lot of focus on the algorithm itself and how it's making decisions. But I think it's important to understand, because these models rely on administrative data, it relies on seeing like a state. And how does the state see people? This particular rubric is from New York. MAPS, I can't even actually remember what it stands for, but systems love abbreviations and acronyms, doesn't matter. The point is, what's very interesting when you look at this is most people don't self-identify in these categories. And in particular, what's interesting about New York is that Latinos is trumps African-American. So if you identify as any kind of Hispanic category, you are no longer counted as Black. So when we're looking into that data and it's a decrease of Black people being enrolled in either preventive services or in foster care, this can be a difference in the way that people are being counted. And I just thought that it was interesting. And I also, this is more specific to Allegheny County, but it's again, for example, in addition to being biracial, Black American, and my mother is white in the US, my family is also from the southern region of Ethiopia, Oromia, and I've been learning a lot. Shout out to my friend and colleague, Ayantu Tubeso, who's been studying Oromo knowledge production, and we've been thinking about indigenous forms of governance, indigenous archiving, and indigenous relationships. And in the Oromo form of governance in Gada, when you are born into the group of people from that year. You are also born into the region that you are born into. And so you're not just the child of your biological mother and your biological father. You have so many ties that are recognized and acknowledged specifically through oral traditions and not through text. And this is true in many parts of the world and in many of the communities that are targeted by the child welfare system. This is not reflected in the administrative data. When we're looking through the administrative data, we're seeing like a state. And I thought this was helpful. I know Anjana also showed some of the 431, 451 variables that the Allegheny Family Screening Tool relies on to make predictive risk scores about whether a child is going to be either a part of a repeat report or repeat removal. But I thought this was helpful just to show, we have our own set of familial and communal relationships, but what is codified into these systems is a very carceral mode of seeing a community. The alleged perpetrator, granted, it does allow for, you could be both a guardian and a perpetrator, but you cannot be like you know, the person that braids hair, right? That is historically in the African-American community, you know, people would braid even freedom routes through people's braids. And this cannot be reflected into the data. Administrative data is inherently hyper individualistic and very carceral. And so again, you know, a lot of what I know is not special. I've learned from the people in my community, a lot of impacted parents, international adoptees, and a group of scholars who I have been really grateful for their support in both in my own scholarship, and I linked the article that I recently published, Calculating the Souls of Black Folk, Predictive Analytics in the New York City Administration of Children's Services in the chat. One particular person I wanted to shout out was Kurt Mundorf. And so the third from the bottom book here is a cultural interpretation of the Genocide Convention. And Kurt is amazing. And the interesting thing about Kurt is that he was a former ACS caseworker. And as somebody who just preys on the downfall of the family regulation system, it's kind of surprising that I would have so many kudos to a former caseworker, right? But what he did is he committed career suicide. I found like 20 years ago, after being an ACS caseworker, he published a piece in the Cardozo Law Journal about invoking the 13th Amendment to abolish the child welfare system. And it was the first piece that I ever read that made this argument and this connection between Reconstruction and the failure of the Freedmen's Bureau to keep families together up until the present, and looking at how caseworkers who are really cops are investigating and traumatizing families. I'm like, this is amazing. Homeboy disappeared. No digital footprint. I'm like, they killed him. Finally, I did find him because his wife was an anthropologist that was the first and only anthropologist actually assigned to the Medical Examiner's Department in New York City. She was a first responder to 9/11 and now is at the body farm doing disaster victim body identification at the University of Knoxville. But one of the first things that Kurt told me was that it was such a relief to go from studying the child welfare system to working officially on the Genocide Convention, because at least people agreed that it was wrong. And this is the difference. You know, people think that it's some kind of microaggression, well-meaning white people issue, some young woman straight out of college that she doesn't understand the complexity of the Black community. No, these people are police officers. They come into your home, they strip search your kid. There is really like no major distinction, but this is not recognized. And part of the reason is this hyper targeting of specific communities that also I think is very important, that we look on like a collective or a population level. So what do you think of when you hear predictive analytics or predictive risk modeling? This is what most people think. Maybe not Beautiful Mind specifically, but they think it's some like very complex math issue. It's about you need to know as much math as you need to know about eugenics. So this is a picture of somebody using a caliper, it's phrenology and trying to figure out, you know, what disability this person had. And just like in eugenics, the primary issue is not that no one has a disability, right? The primary issue is that disability was being used as a classification and a category through which people's rights were taken away from them. They were sterilized, they could have their child removed, they experienced institutionalization and other forms of medical experimentation, right? And so the same issue is with predictive analytics in the family regulation system. It's not that there's no harm that happens in families, that there's never intimate partner violence. That is not a rallying cry of the abolitionist movement. In fact, it's to center actually the people who are harmed and to think through transformative justice and accountability processes. Shout out to Andrea Ritchie, Miriam Kaba, and a lot of Black women who have led the abolitionist movement and that I've learned from about accountability, right? And the other thing I wanted to say about eugenics, I think, you know, people forget is that Hitler was deeply inspired by the American eugenics movement, right? And then they had kind of like a branding problem during the rise of the Third Reich. And so a lot of the eugenics movement got rearticulated as population science and demography and the statistical orienting around human conditions and human life. And so I think that's an important point when we're looking at this enumeration or this calculating of the souls of Black people in these models. I don't know if you guys are into animals, but this is a red herring. and that is to talk about what are the major red herrings in this discourse. I figured one is I can never like stay focused, and I know we don't have a lot of time. So I just wanted to point out a few things while we had this moment. Two big red herrings. People love to talk about disproportionality, disparities, bias. These can die with the system as far as I'm concerned. So disproportionality and disparities, the idea that relative to that demographic category and or the population as a whole, the group is overrepresented. Imagine if I was telling you like, there's this big problem with people being stabbed to death. And then I'm like, oh, but there's too many Black people being stabbed relative to the population. Let's make sure that Black people and white people are evenly stabbed to death. Like, this is not a desirable outcome to me. And so the thing is, I'll stay in this for a moment. Bias. People also love to speak about bias. I know that we were going to have somebody come from the Perception Institute, which from my understanding is the ones that patented the implicit bias assessment or implicit bias tool. And so this is the idea that there's some kind of prejudice, the thoughts of an individual that reflect unfair assumptions or stereotypes about a group. Technically, and it's like what you'll see in a lot of technical papers, are that there are artifacts demonstrating what is fundamentally flawed about human decision-making and which humans, right? The frontline caseworkers. And so there's no point, I know that like a big rallying cry to implement predictive analytics is that somehow it's ameliorating or destroying human bias. There's human decision-making like all up and down the pipeline. What predictive analytics is changing is the point at which decisions are made away from the frontline caseworkers who are disproportionately Black, up higher up the food chain to the developers, to the executives of the child welfare, family regulation system. And so how we define the problem shapes how we define the solution. So bias and disproportionality are fantastic if you want to implement predictive analytics, because they don't ask us to look across the system. They don't ask us to look at like structurally, why have we systematically separated Black and Indigenous families? They don't even ask us to look across time. This is my big thing. And, Kerr-Mundorf and I are hoping to have a citizens tribunal to investigate whether Article 2E of the Genocide Convention, the systematic removal of children from a protective group into another group, meets the criteria for genocide, specifically by the New York City Administration of Children's Services. When you're looking at the height of removals in the 1990s, correlating with the Clinton crime bill, right? You have the systematic parents being incarcerated, the children being placed into care. We look at just, this year, removals went down, we're improving disproportionality bias, something. But in reality, what has happened over time? And when we're looking at the implementation of preventive services, largely we're surveilling the children of the people who were removed as adults. Well, the number one risk factor was the parent in the child welfare system. But if you want to sell and you want to implement predictive risk modeling, bias and disproportionality, fantastic. I'll try to hurry up.
Yeah, we have about 1 minute left.
All right, I'm gonna go fast.
Okay.
Has us ask these questions. I just wanted to go, so why predictive risk modeling, right? Is it fundamentally that we're afraid for kids to be home alone? No, look, it was a white child being home alone was a franchise. It was sold to us, right? It's very entertaining, but we like to sell Black children. What does it make us think? At the end of the day, sorry, this is my other video. Let me just stop the share and I'll just make this last comment. At the end of the day, predictive risk model, because of its reliance on administrative data, assumes that the problem lies within families, lies within communities. It uses data from the police about families. It doesn't use data about the police abusing and murdering Black children. It doesn't use data from the Department of Homeless Services about the squalid conditions to keep children in. That's it.
All right, Aaron.
All right, hard to top Khadijah, but I will do a simpler, more technical presentation for you. Sharing the screen. So I think for me, and as the ACLU starts to investigate what's going on in the system, oops, nope. Can you all see my screen? Okay. All right, so we sort of have three major concerns as we start to investigate predictive analytics in the child welfare system. For me, this is informed by 4 or 5 years of work in the criminal justice system, evaluating and in some cases building algorithms and seeing what happened there, and seeing pretty similar patterns happening as these tools start to get applied and considered for use in the predictive, in the child welfare system. I think at the top, the biggest question that we have is, will these tools make the lives of impacted families better? And I think it's important to raise, by whose definition are we making those families' lives better? I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is that the tool creators have a lot of power over what that definition is in these situations, as well as the child welfare systems themselves. But as you probably just listened to, there are a lot of harms, and the question of whether those harms are meaningful is something that we need to pay attention to. I think the second question for us is, what policy choices are embedded in the design such choices of algorithms? So anytime an algorithm is implemented, you are essentially systemizing a series of choices that may have been made without the algorithm or with an older algorithm in the past. And the question that we have is, what are those choices? Are communities involved in making those choices? And are we sure that these are the choices that we want to make? I think the last thing that we should all be paying attention to is, what remedies exist for people impacted by these systems? If this tool is implemented and you are already in the system, does it make it easier or harder for you to escape the system? I think this is a question that we raise, especially as the ACLU, when we think about things like due process for these families. I think the first thing that I would point to, and this is sort of, when we think about, will these algorithms make families' lives better? The criminal justice system, especially in the pretrial space, is probably 5 to 10 years ahead of where the child welfare system is in terms of the application of these tools. So in the pretrial space, the decision is whether or not to release people pretrial. And those tools, maybe 10 years ago, were sold as being these sort of panaceas that would solve all the problems within those systems. But the reality has been quite different. To my knowledge, there's actually only one state in the country for which incarceration decreased as a result or related to the use of these algorithms, and that was New Jersey, and I'll get back to that. Incarceration has increased in lots of other places where algorithms were mandated by states, or at least stayed the same pre-trial. None of these algorithms have ever been recorded to decrease disparities in pre-trial incarceration, and disparities have been shown to be substantially increased or accelerated in many states as well. So I think when we look at these things and we look at comparables, we should really ask the question of whether or not these things will actually make things any better. I think looking at New Jersey is instructive. There wasn't just a change in building and requiring the use of an algorithm. There was also significant policy change that really mattered for what happened there. So in the case of New Jersey, police officers were shifted dramatically to using summons, so basically requests to attend court versus arrests. There were substantial process reforms to improve speedy trial rates, and there were higher barriers to pretrial custody. So when they looked at those algorithms, they specifically prevented essentially pretrial incarceration for whole classes of folks. I think when we look at what's happened in Allegheny so far, which is the best documented of, I think, many places at this point, we see similar outcomes. So Allegheny implemented, I think, the tool for the first time in 2015. Since that time, out-of-home placements have increased for Black children to the point that it's actually higher than it's been in the past decade. They stayed the same for white children, and for other races, it also looks like it stayed the same. So we spend a lot of money, a lot of time a lot of shifts in resources and we don't see much of a difference. And I think that's a pretty common experience for many places that have implemented predictive analytics. I think in the impact evaluation report, there's also a question of whether this changes the workload of folks involved in the CWS system. And it doesn't really seem like it. Screenings today are no less than they were before the implementation of AMST. And I think we should all be asking the question of what do these things actually do in these systems, and do they make the systematic change that many of us are hoping for? I think it's important, as myself, an algorithm developer, to sort of try and lift the veil on these things. They're not as complicated as many think, and there are a lot of decisions that are made along the way of building an algorithm that are values choices, that are not just scientific or evidence-based choices. So they're sort of at the beginning of this cycle, it's when we're trying to define the problem, it's who decides what we are trying to predict and what are we deciding to predict. There are different variables that can be chosen that we think of as proxies for ultimately whether or not a child is harmed. I think there's also questions, and I'll get to this, about what the costs of the actual intervention are to the families associated and whether or not we're balancing that. There's a big question about who gets to decide what variables end up in the model. Now in Allegheny, they use a purely model-based approach to choose the variables that end up in the model, but that also is a values choice because you let the model choose based purely on accuracy what parameters to keep in and what not to use. And there are other value systems that we need to pay attention to besides just accuracy when we think about what variables go into a model, like whether or not people can ever escape if those variables are inherently linked to things that you've done in the system a long time ago. Michael's giving me the hand, so I will try to move quickly. So I wanted to lay out, I think, a bunch of different places where tool designers make choices that make a difference. I think when defining the problem, one thing is that I think is really critical is the cost of false positives or negatives. So whether or not you make a choice to send somebody into somebody's home and strip search somebody's kids, which is, I think, what Khadija said, and I feel like we need to listen to those and weigh those experiences when you actually make these choices, but most tool designers don't. I think there's a question of what metrics we evaluate, whether or not recourse matters, whether or not people can do anything about these systems means something. Then when you actually get the model into production and you're using it, there is the question of what thresholds to make decisions on. So in the case of the Allegheny tool, if you have a score of 18 or higher, you are automatically essentially investigated unless somebody talks to their supervisor and overrides that. But there are no corresponding thresholds that say if you have a score below a certain amount that you can't investigate somebody and you should let them live their lives. And I think finally in monitoring, what do you monitor? Are you paying attention to the fact that for most models, you can amplify a lot of problems as those models are used over time? And I think just to sort of show, again, sort of all the different decision points that are being made, this is a graph from a dissertation done by one of Rima's grad students that shows the probability of placement on the right axis and the probability of sensitive death on the left. And we can see that even if you make the algorithm quote unquote fair for the final outcome variable, Black families who have a very high probability of placement actually have a much lower risk of death. And so fairness may not actually be achieved because you're not looking at all the metrics. I think there's a sort of other questions here about the placement threshold. So who decides what that threshold is? How is it decided? Does the community have input? I think these are all questions that we need to be asking.
Aaron, I'm going to have to stop you. I'm sorry, because we have to get to Q&A. So can you just wrap it up in 30 seconds?
In 30 seconds or less, these are the questions I think we should be asking on top of the many other questions. Does this make people's lives better? Is it actually doing anything to change the system? I'm not sure. I don't think so far. What policy choices are embedded into the design/choices of these algorithms? A lot. And right now, impacted communities are brought after these things are built, not before. And I think what remedies exist for people impacted by these systems? Not a lot. Once you're in, these tools by definition are likely to increase their perception of your risk and therefore increase the odds that your family is separate.
All right, thank you, Aaron. All right, so folks, we're going to now move to our question and answer portion of the evening. You've asked so many great questions, and leading our discussion with the audience is Professor Williams-Isom, who is the James R. Dumpson Endowed Chair in Child Welfare at Fordham University's Graduate School of Social Service. We're going to turn it over to Professor Williams-Isom. You're on mute.
Thank you so much and good evening. And I was supposed to do thank you, so I'm not going to do thank yous because there's too many people out there that have too many good questions. We talked about why did we disable the chat. I think we did it because we thought there were 500 people that were going to be here today, and sometimes the chat can be distracting, but we hear you loud and clear. We've talked about doing this. Clearly, we need to do this again. It wasn't enough time, so we promise you we will do this again. We wanted this to be about sharing information. Next time, we want to focus on New York City in particular, and maybe we should just have the last one just be a conversation where there are no formal presentations, but we just go ahead and have a conversation. So I apologize in advance. I'm going to try to get to as many questions as we can because there were a lot of good ones. You asked about, let me say this out loud, whether or not we can share the presentations that were here. And so we will make sure to do that. We also, after this event, are going to be sending out a survey so that you can give us some more of your feedback and give us some of your questions. Let's see, where do I want to start? Here, and I think false confidence, someone, I can't remember who talked about false confidence. It might've been you, Anjana. So could a false confidence concern argument be used to prevent the adoption of any new and potentially useful tools? Wouldn't a careful adoption with this concern in mind be more appropriate? Anjana?
Sure. So I think one of the things that is clear is I think we also have at the ACLU, we still have questions about allocation of resources. And I think this responds in part, I will say, to Emily's point of like, well, why aren't we or the ACLU looking at the current way in which calls are screened? I think it's a false dichotomy or false like choices to say our options are either what's happening now or this predictive analytic tool. And the question for me is, can you do something that's not quite there? And on the question of, are there good uses of tools? I think one of the questions that I've certainly posed is, and this goes to the point of one of the things that tools doesn't do is shift the focus away from the assumption that there's a failing or deficiency in the family if someone doesn't meet certain criteria or fulfill certain services. But to the extent that there are interventions that the child welfare system is doing, why not actually measure success rates where success is defined as, and this is another, I think, but this is also a values and policy question, is certainly where success is defined as a non-foster care placement.
Thank you. So this question came up a lot. Wouldn't a predictive tool be as good as the quality of the historical data, which may be prone to inaccuracies and biases? How do predictive tools account for this? Rima and maybe Emily?
So there is a concern with both bias in decision making and bias in data. So we start with the premise that both are biased, that the decisions we make are subject to bias and the data that they generate are subject to bias. So why do we know, in a sense, how do we know they're biased? We use the data to try to uncover that bias. So at that, there is a way in which we can try to address bias through using the data to reveal the bias. So as an example I gave you, we went back to look at children who were risk scored and by the tool and what their screening rates were prior to the tool being available, and found that children who scored a low risk, Black children were being screened in at a higher rate. So that told us that the screening decision with respect to the history that the tool assumed had bias in it. So there was already a departure between the tool and the actions. In order to make sure that the tool also addresses bias and is able to predict ground truth, we also look at how well the tool calibrates to things that we feel are less and less potentially biased. Things like fatalities and near fatalities, things like universal hospitalization for severe maltreatment. Those are sort of more closer to being system independent measures of maltreatment and abuse. So those are sort of two techniques we use, but Emily, you might want to
we're not going to do, I don't think I have time
sorry.
for both. Sorry about that. So we're just going to, let's be also careful with our answers so that they're a little short. So Khadijah, this is for you. I feel like it's more of a statement and maybe you can add to it. It says, with an understanding that the child protective system's roots are in chattel slavery and in the systemic takings of Indigenous children, I'm confused as how we can ignore the regulatory and policing nature of child protective system, especially if we are to do a critical review. Don't you need a critical perspective grounded in an understanding of the system's history and evolution? And I would say I've got probably 12 more comments just like that. Khadijah, would you want to reply to that?
1,000%, and we need abolitionists on this side of the webinar. I would say my biggest concern within the abolitionist and organizing space is that there's not an integrated understanding of technology. When tech comes up, it's used as an entry point to have the real conversation on policing. But when we're talking about the question that Emily and Rima just responded to, my concern is not just the garbage in, garbage out of the dirty data, but this comes from Dorothy Roberts, but what is qualitatively new about predictive analytics? What are the new forms of surveillance and social control that are being produced here? And we can't just assert that we're abolitionists. We have to actually understand what we're up against in order to dismantle it. And so we need y'all. And we need, and reach out to me, because we need teachings, we need political education, we need more people.
And Khadijah put her information in the chat so you can get her email and her information there. Okay, we got another question. When you assess for risk and resources and interventions, do you use the data to inform how we align preventive services grounded in child welfare within the context of other systems that impact children? Anyone? Everybody's quiet. Nobody wants to answer that one, or you didn't understand it?
I didn't quite understand it, Anne, sorry.
Okay, when you assess for risk and resource the interventions, do you use the data to inform how we align preventive services grounded in child welfare within the context of the other systems that impact children?
Well, I'm happy to try to take a pass at this because it actually came up in a community meeting I was in just this week, where one of the things that's been really interesting to see in Los Angeles County, just in the 3 pilot offices, is that there seems to be, to some extent, a mismatch between the number of kind of complex risk investigations in a given office, where it would signal that there may be more needs that are not quite being met by other systems, and the number of prevention slots. Again, I'm not saying that there are, but that was one of the things that came up, was how do we start to also use that information to say, how do we invest differently based on need in the community in a way that we haven't always had the data to see in the past.
Got it. And Emily, since you're speaking, as you know, there's tons of questions for you, but the one I'm going to put, which I think is most of the feelings that people are having, is why reject the framework that child welfare systems are in fact systems of family regulation, surveillance, and policing, a view that has been vigorously supported by luminary scholars like Dorothy Roberts, Laura Briggs, and Ricky Solinger. not to mention a view supported by non-academically credentialized people who are directly impacted by the system. So you had a good presentation, and then you at the end sort of said, and you know, it's not a family regulation system. And I guess people are saying, why reject that?
Actually, I didn't mean that I don't think that there is a surveillance component to it or a regulation. I think that when we use the language of family regulation, we are losing track of the fact that we have children who need protection. And I do think that the system is not perfectly situated right now. One of the things that I've actually found problematic is that we are, and actually, Khadijah, you talk about this in your paper, and I really appreciated that. The more we try to couple all sorts of services to child protection, we potentially grow and grow that system, as opposed to thinking that it should be smaller and responding very specifically to concerns. I think maybe where I just disagree with some folks at the ACLU is the role that predictive analytics potentially plays in helping that system course correct, so we can be that much more specific and careful at the front door of our system.
Thank you. Rima, for you, why did New Zealand drop the tool? It would be interesting to hear the experience, and do you know of jurisdictions that determined that the tool was not the way to go? And I think, Anjana, that was a question that I saw in the chat, that there were 7 jurisdictions that decided not to use it. And people are like, why did those jurisdictions decide not to use it? Do either of you have an answer to that?
And before
Yes.
I go on to that, I just wanted to correct slide that Aaron had. Am I able to do that, or do you want me to do that in another
Go
slide?
ahead, you can.
Oh, thank you. So I just want to share with you the slide of our evaluation of racial disparities following AFST. This is removal rates before, conditional on being screened in before. This is black GPS. These are blue is white. And quite contrary to what Aaron did, because Aaron was looking at some very particular data, he was looking at the numbers, and the numbers change over time because the number of people living in Allegheny change over time. The children who are called in change over time. So what we're really interested in is what's happening to AFST as a result of conditional on screening in. And what you can see is that the black-white difference falls. So before the tool, the black removal rates, conditional on being screened in, was considerably higher than the white. After the tool came in, the disparities fell. So I just wanted to correct, because that what he was showing was just counts, and it's not a causal study. So coming back to our New Zealand, I don't know if you want Anjana to
respond?
take. Yeah.
Yes, you can respond.
Okay, so first of all, totally right, not causal. I would ask you if the screen-in rate after the implementation of AFST has decreased substantially, and by how much since it was implemented. Because I've seen these numbers and it looks the same to me as it was 5 years ago.
So the question that we were trying to understand, Aaron, is did differential removal rates, were they affected by the AFST? And we actually did what's called a triple difference, because we have a bunch of referrals that don't get affected.
I think Aaron's asking a different question. So Aaron, in terms of referral rate, screen-in rates, what you have to remember, the goal with these tools is that we're doing a better job consistently screening in higher risk children and screening out more low risk children. So you can see the overall screen-in rate remain totally flat, while at the same time seeing that the sorting of investigations that are taking place has shifted. That was the goal.
Here, though, there are no less investigations as a percentage today as there were when you started this. So the definition of riskiness is your definition of riskiness.
So
by your definition, this is correct.
So Aaron, I guess the interesting part about this is we are trying to have this technical conversation, but going back to the point that we see in the chat is people are like, It is a technical conversation, but it's about people's lives. So I actually want to read this really quickly as I go into my next chat. It is extremely obvious that some people on this panel are salespeople, a capitalist selling products, and that they use in institutions that they will benefit from. Universities and research and companies are financially benefiting from making this product. I think it is very important to state that Black bodies can no longer and will no longer exist for whites to profit from. Instead of investing in communities, instead of eradicating poverty, they find a more profitable to continue to capitalize off of our Black bodies. I want to infuse that into the conversation because I know you all are talking about the numbers and what's technical and what's this and that, and people are just hearing more ways to keep Black bodies oppressed and more ways to take children away while people are saying that they care about Black and brown children. There's a bunch of things, Khadijah, here that say no real question, just shout outs to Khadijah, and you killed it, you did a good job. So I wanted everybody to say that. Let me see. Let's see.
Can I just respond to that one statement?
Sure.
I'll keep it very brief. I just wanted to say, like, look, y'all, it's a war out here. You know, people are very nice and white supremacy can be very nice. And just everybody's positionality here is very important. Some people are running these systems. Some people are being targeted and separated by these systems. We desperately need y'all out here because it's not a math problem. To the degree it's a math problem, holla at me, email me. I will help you understand logistic regression, but that is not the primary issue. Just like they were separating us at the auction block, just like they were separating us in the slave ship, is the way that they separating us on Rikers Island, is the way that they separating us through machine learning and artificial intelligence. That's it.
Jenny, I know that there was a question for you about LA County, and it says, can Jenny discuss how LA County has responded to the news that low-risk youth who are Black are more likely to be screened in than low-risk youth who are white or Latino? How can that be remedied when the LA tool that might help correct this doesn't have the chance to intervene until screen-in decisions have already been made? Along these lines, what LA County neighborhoods are most likely to experience low-risk youth being screened in for investigations that end with unsubstantiations and no services? So I guess they're just asking what do you make of what people are finding out about this already?
So what I can offer is that LA County is not using it to screen in or screen out calls. And so I don't really have a specific response to that in relations to using it to screen at the hotline. We are using it to review the low risk families that were already screened in for opportunities to change the practice, but we really haven't gotten to what that looks like or what the results of that or what the next course of action or recommendation would be, because we just recently began testing out just kind of what we're exploring at this point.
Okay, thank you. These are, again, I think more kinds of statements. What evidence do we have besides an extremely small number of front page incidents of child abuse that children need protection? We've said that a lot here, rather than families need support, which is not something that family policing is equipped to do. Second to that is, what evidence do we have that parental substance use equals more negative outcomes for children than negative outcomes that children experience in family policing systems? We don't have enough research for this. So those are some of the points that we kind of say things and we assume that they're true, and people in the audience are pushing back on that. Khadijah, the question for you, and I don't know if this is a serious question, but I guess it says, what can we do as a society if a child is born into an unacceptable condition to unfit parents if the child welfare system is abolished? I guess this is another one of those questions about, don't we need the system and isn't that the only way to protect children? Khadijah, can you address that?
One is, I answered it in one of the questions, but there is, I want to say Aid to Abolition did an amazing packet on transformative justice approach to child sexual abuse. And so they're actual organizers. Like when we say this, it's not just like to have a nice little phrase. Like there are people who are working on accountability processes. How do you address actual harm? The other thing that I want to say is this real complicated predictive analytic model is not inevitable. When I say it's a war, we could win, y'all. This does not have to be implemented. They trying. They do not have to succeed. We can win. They got salespeople. We got fighters. This is not inevitable. We can fight back.
Let's see. This is fascinating and yet so problematic at the same time. Oh, and my dog is starting to bark. That means we have 4 minutes. The struggle is real. Sure wish we could have engaged with each other as participants in the chat. Our language and our precisionality is so important in every discussion about others. We are paid to judge. I think that we are at 7 o'clock. I actually think that that is a good place to end, which is that we learned. I know I learned a lot in this session. I know that we, as I said, we are going to be handing out a survey to everybody. I do want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the deans at Fordham and at NYU, Michael Lindsey, Rose Louis Pierre did a really great job. All of the panelists, thank you for saying yes. Clearly it wasn't enough time. All the people in the background, Trish, Connor, Matt, Cheryl, Lori, Shirley, everyone, people who made the flyers. We're going to do this again soon. I thank you all for being here with us and for sharing this time with us, and we will be in touch soon. Good night, everyone, and thank you.
Thanks, Anne.
You're welcome. Good evening.